You'll remember, I hope, that we opened this conference with a call out to every individual in this audience and to ask you to use this time together to forge individual relationships with one another. And I think we just had the most amazing illustration of the fact that that applies to government too. Government agencies aren't monoliths, they're not acronyms, they are people, collections of people who I think you understand are profoundly and personally dedicated to doing this right. But they cannot do it alone. As we just heard, and as we all know, we all need one another. And so personal and sincere thanks for coming and being a part of this and sharing true heart and true commitment. And I hope that everybody engages with that in the spirit in which it was offered. So thank you. I'm going to ask our panel to join us now. And this panel is going to talk with some specificity about the problem of lone actors being connected online. What we know, what we don't know, and what we need to do about it. So if we can have our next panel take the stage. The other thing I will do a little shout out for is the director talked about the concerning rise of hate among young people. You know we have a complete track on that that's continuing today. So if you have an interest in that topic, please take a look at that. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn the lectern over to one of the members of our executive committee of the Eradicate Hate Summit, Jerry Cohen.
Good morning. As you heard, my name is Jared Cohen, the former president of Carnegie Mellon and a member of the executive committee. 4 months ago, on May 14th of this year, a white 18-year-old drove 200 miles from his upstate New York home to Buffalo's east side, where he murdered 10 black people at the Tops Friendly Market, the latest in a series of hate-fueled mass shootings. We heard a bit about Buffalo in the through line of threat session yesterday. Today we have 2 sessions devoted to the Buffalo shootings. This first one, as Laura just referred to, is really intended to set the background about the shootings. We'll talk about it in detail and its connections to other events like it. The next session is devoted to lessons learned. We have 4 excellent speakers. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak, and as I introduce you, please come up here and take a seat at the up on the stage. We have Emma Juen, Director of Programs and Research on Extremism at Parents for Peace. Emma has developed a methodology for analyzing incidents like this, and she's going to tell us about her results from analyzing the Buffalo shooting. Oren Siegel, who we heard yesterday. Hey guys, come on up. Oren Siegel, who admitted yesterday that he's an aspiring power forward for the New York Knicks. While he's waiting for the call, he's serving as Vice President of the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League. He'll talk about what motivated the shooter, his beliefs, how it connects to the mainstream thinking, and to other events as well. We also have Rita Katz, founder and executive director of the Site Intelligence Group. And I want you to know that Rita just has a new book that has just come out, published by Columbia University Press. It's entitled Saints and Soldiers, Inside Internet Age Terrorism, From Syria to the Capitol Siege. It's on sale here at the conference by special arrangement because it's not actually out yet. And Rita tells me the proceeds from those sales will go to the Buffalo victims. She'll talk about the culture of extremism and the similarity of this event to others. And Marc-Andre Argentino, you never know when he'll show up. Thanks for coming, Marc-Andre. You never know what he's going to say either, so I have no idea. But I know it'll be interesting, and he'll expand on what we hear from others. Marc-Andre, in fact, was part of that thread discussion that we heard yesterday. He's affiliated with ICSR and Concordia University, and it's always a pleasure to have him part of these conferences. So, each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a round-robin open discussion. Colleagues, take it away. Emma, you're up.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Emma Jouen. I'm the Director of Programs and Research at Parents for Peace. And so I would like to talk to you a bit more about the behavioral and sociological factors behind the radicalization of the Buffalo shooter. So on May 14, 2022, he entered the Top supermarket in Buffalo and murdered 10 people, injuring 3 others. And I would like to start by introducing the work of Parents for Peace and my organization and the methodology behind this analysis that I will present to you. So Parents for Peace is an organization which has developed intervention strategies for families where loved ones has been radicalized or has fallen into extremism. We have developed the following theory of change based on hundreds of interventions. And so you can see as follows that we see radicalization as the result of unaddressed grievances mixed with an identity crisis that then create a space to fill and a need for structure, a sense of belonging, of purpose, or brotherhood that is then filled by groomers. Our role at Parents for Peace is twofold. 1, to identify those unaddressed grievances, and 2, to replace the groomers and to serve as this support network for families, for loved ones, or anyone willing to get involved. And we developed our methodology based on hundreds of interviews with families of extremists, former extremists, and individuals still grappling with extremism. And through those interventions and those interviews, we were able to recognize and identify pathways of radicalization. So we've seen hundreds of cases, created unrefined narrative, developed coding patterns. Time and time again, they've been restructured and reorganized. And today, we have 11 coding categories that we use in order to be able to holistically identify those grievances. For the sake of time, I'll only be introducing 5 in the case of the Buffalo shooter in order to be able to go a bit more in depth about identifying those different grievances. So the Buffalo case was identifying 672 pages of what we refer to as the diary, but really is a stream of consciousness that he posted on Discord, initially privately, and that was then he then made public during the morning of his attack. So the diaries go from November 21st, 2021, up until the day of the attack. And so all the information that I'm going to be talking about and those grievances are going to be based on the analysis through those 8 months, more or less. So one thing that's important to note as well in this case that isn't necessarily the case when we do interventions at Parents for Peace is that it is a stream of consciousness. So a lot of it, and what he talks about often is a self-diagnosis or a self-analysis. So there might be some personal bias within his own evaluation. But we've seen so many cases at Parents for Peace that reflect same patterns and same pathways of radicalization that I can tell and we can tell that this analysis is also rooted in truth. And so I'm going to be dividing those grievances into 2 aspects. The first one, the external factors. And so the first external factor is looking into his radicalization timeline. So we can identify very clearly COVID-19 as the incubator for his radicalization. Not because of it's linked to conspiracy theories or to any kind of QAnon-related issues, but really because of the isolation and the mental health crisis that happened, especially amongst young men in the United States, that led for him to be isolated and to spend way more time online than he would ever have. The means they used in order to get further and further into the radicalization was Discord, but also numerous other virtual channels and online forums. And something that's not present on that slide as well, but is really important, is the catalyst for the violence and the accelerator for violence is on March 25th, 2022, so a few days after his initial plan of the attack and a few months before the actual attack. He goes on to attack a cat that was attacking his own cat and starts going into this frenzy and stabbing time and time again this cat, cutting it into pieces, asking his mother, when the cat is fully dead, for a box to bury the cat in, where we see another family responsibility that I'll be talking about. And his legacy that he's trying to make work is to have this 180-page manifesto that he then publishes online on the same model of others. His timeline of target setting is pretty quick. It starts on November, but he mentions years of planning. Initially as an attack date on the Christchurch anniversary on March 15, but goes back and forth between suicidal ideation and perpetrating the attack, and finally perpetrates it on the 14th of May. His virtual influence, that my colleagues will go into it a bit further, is very obvious in his phone and social media addiction that he's fully aware of and mentions several times throughout his diaries, saying that every time he has doubts about his willingness to commit the attack, he spends 5 minutes on 4chan and his motivation returns. So he's been using 4chan regularly since May 2020, goes on Reddit, Discord, and the list here, and also mentions other manifestos and access to live streams, especially Brenton Tarrant and the Christchurch attack, mentioned more than 30 times within his own diaries as an influence for his ideology. And now on the internal factors, more linked to his own personal grievances and how they were built. So one of the first examples is his mental health. Throughout his diary, both self-diagnosed and officially diagnosed, you can see strong anxiety and depression. Suicidal ideation is very prominent. He initially mentions that his desire to purchase all those weapons was linked to his desire to commit suicide and nothing to do with actually perpetrating a crime. He also has very often distorted perceptions of reality. He mentions a few dissociative episodes where he doesn't feel in touch with reality, he loses ground and feels confused, and has a very strong paranoia and conspiracy mindset that you can also find in his ideology, very strongly reflected. Mentions that he's convinced that he has dandruffs or a few health issues because of the level of iron in the shower or other links that are also always attributed to other communities. His physical health is very often the result of his own anxiety. He's obsessed with his weight and with his self-image, takes a lot of pictures that he posts onto his diary. He weighs himself several times. He writes down everything that he's been eating. He has very strong hypochondria as well in terms of social anxiety. He's convinced that he has jaw pain, and he has a lot of few related issues. He has many anxiety attacks that, again, he is going to never acknowledge the anxiety side of it, but always find some grander scheme related to some paranoia or some conspiracy. His family environment, as I mentioned, is implicitly earlier within the mom's reaction after the stabbing of the cat, is neglectful. He repeatedly mentioned in his diaries what he calls pro tips of what his parents and what parents should be doing, how they should react when their kids are engaging in behavior, how they should care more for him. It talks about the fact that they don't care about him, about his living, about the noise that they make, that they never ask him questions, that they haven't even noticed that he doesn't go to school anymore and that he just hides in his room, that they are the roots of many problems. And whenever he falls into this anxiety, the ideology comes back. In this attack, we have the strong ideology seems to be against the Black community, but there's also very strong anti-Semitic. And he mentioned Jewish people as being responsible for all the issues that exist in the world, especially bad parenting when it comes to it. And then finally, the trauma that he's been going to and the different perceptions of danger that he has. So we described 2 events of bullying that are very important. One where he was invited at a party where he was the only one to dress up and felt self-conscious about this and felt alone and very lonely. And the second one about this young Black girl who bullied him and abused him in front of a lot of people and where he felt helpless. He also mentions neglect from his family, from the mental health community, during an episode that he has after he's referenced by the school staff to the mental health community in order to access, where he has to wait 20 hours to only get a 50-minute long evaluation, and so criticizes the American mental health system a lot. And then finally also alludes to, very briefly, a near-death and a drowning experience when he was way younger in a lake when he was 6 years old. So all those different coding of the manifesto really enables us to identify potential grievances that were then exploited by this identity crisis, by COVID-19, and by the relevant people on this passive radicalization as well on social media.
Thank you very much, Emma. Oren?
Okay, if everybody just shut your ears for 1 second. I have to clear my throat. Okay, sorry. Also, I know people's attention spans are about 7 minutes, so this was an effort to sort of reset so we can focus here. So I'm Oren Siegel. I'm the Vice President of the Center on Extremism, and I want to just say a couple things about the center and then get into kind of what we did that day, what we're seeing, and how this fits this awful shooting into a series of shootings in this country, but also how the narratives, the fundamental ideology, continues to impact not only the fringe spaces, but our public discussion. So at the Center on Extremism, we have analysts and investigators and experts who are, many of them spending most of their waking hours in the online spaces in which extremism and hate is incubated, right? We are seeing every single day how people are trying to leverage these online spaces, not only with just hateful memes and ideologies, but with providing practical steps for others who may be in that space so that they can take action, right? It's the classic seeing what's happening in the online space and see how it animates real-world activity. What we're trying to do is actually prevent or warn those before the online activity results in tragedy on the ground. We're not batting 1,000, right? For every case where we've been able to share our information early on because of some of the indicators that we're seeing to law enforcement, to what we believe to prevent an attack, we know that there are also times, unfortunately many times in this country, where we're unable to stop that. We don't have the visibility into all the online spaces. And I want to make a comment that's going to be hard to hear, but even in this case, looking at the diary that you mentioned, the manifesto, the live stream of the attack, maybe not the live stream, but the first 2 parts, they're kind of unremarkable in many ways in terms of what we see online. There are hundreds and thousands of people who are spreading the same messages as the Buffalo shooter did before his attack. The hard part is identifying when is this person going to take action. So we provide information to law enforcement. We know how extremists talk, their coded messages, et cetera. We try to work with the industry, the tech industry in particular, to help identify so they could preemptively stop the exploitation of their platforms. And ultimately, we're trying to secure the safety of communities. What that means, though, when we don't catch somebody, when we don't see something ahead of time, is when there's an attack like we saw in Buffalo, we immediately try to go back and assess an online footprint. What did we miss? What are we seeing? And this is where manifestos and diaries and other information can be super useful, especially in the early stages of an investigation. You know, local law enforcement often doesn't know what the motivation is. They're dealing with the community, et cetera. I know we're going to be hearing more about that in the next panel. So what we're trying to do is provide as much useful information based on the clues that we're seeing online. And frankly, the commonalities with this shooting and other shootings were vast. I mean, from the location that was targeted, right? Based on the writings of this shooter, you know, he was looking for a community that had a high percentage of African Americans. We saw in the El Paso, Texas shooting, that individuals also drove several hours in order to find a community, you know, that was, in their words, saturated with Hispanics, right? So identifying a community for your target. I think one of the most depressing and difficult elements that we're seeing in commonality was the live stream, right? Here's somebody, as we saw in Christchurch in New Zealand, as we saw in other efforts in Poway, but elsewhere, he decided to signal back to his online community in very explicit ways by using the weapons in order to send a message, right? And today, extremists are preparing their social media activity at the same time that they're preparing their attacks and their weapons. It goes hand in hand. It's frankly a blueprint that we see pretty much almost every single time with some of these terrible mass shooters. So he live streamed this event on the same platform that the shooter in Halle, Germany, who was attacking a synagogue, live streamed his attack as well. And on the weapons, if you just look at the weapons that this individual used, it was almost like a dark history lesson of extremism and hate around the world. The amount of writing that this person was able to literally put on his weapons was quite shocking, frankly. So you had white supremacist symbols and phrases and messages. You had literally the names of previous attackers in Norway, here in Pittsburgh, in Poway, in Charleston, South Carolina. The number 2083, which was a reference to the title of the manifesto of the Norway shooter. Names of various killers, including those killers of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia in 2020, right? So he was sort of updating this sort of history lesson by using more current examples than we even saw in Christchurch. And some of the symbols that he put on his weapons were literally taken and referencing back the same ones that we saw in the Christchurch attack. Above the trigger that he had, he literally put the name of a scientist who was connecting and linking IQ to race. This was a Nobel Prize winning scientist who was stripped of his prize in 2019 because of his racist ideas. I mean, so the amount of information, the amount of research that he did, the availability of all this information was easy for him. And I want to say it's really important, and what I really sort of appreciate about what you said is like, what are the on-the-ground, real-life, offline motivations, right? We often don't see that early enough because we're not in every community, right? But there are people with mental health issues. There are people who have other indicators that, you know, whether it's bullying, et cetera, that they may be vulnerable. And then there's an entire online world that is ready to prey upon those people and give them the ideological justification so they can take their pain and anxiety and fit it with a narrative so that they can feel like they belong to something. Again, this is like rinse and repeat. We see this all the time. And so one of the other elements is where we see this, learning from other attackers, is we did an analysis of the manifesto of the Buffalo shooter, and literally 63% of the Christchurch manifesto was copied and pasted, like word for word. So easy to find, put it in a new document. The Q&A section of the Christchurch shooter's manifesto was lifted. But this is where it gets interesting, right? In the sense of this person was able to replace certain answers with his own worldview, right? So it's not just all take, you know, a meme or other written material from somebody else and just repeat it. Everybody's able to put their own twist on that, again, with the hopes that the next shooter, the next person that they're trying to prey upon, will have the latest sort of version, updated like hate manual, if you will. I think it's also really important to note, and you touched upon this, that the hatred that motivated the Buffalo shooter was clearly targeted at the African American community, but it was informed by anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. So just as we saw here in Pittsburgh, where there was an individual who was obsessed with immigration and targeted the Jewish community, here's somebody that in many ways in Buffalo was obsessed with the Jewish community, wanted to start a war against the Jews, and targeted the African American community. Now, great replacement doesn't mean just replacing the type of targets that you hate or the communities that you want to target. But in many ways, that's what this great replacement theory is all about. It's about a set of grievances where you can replace the target of your hatred because they're all sort of connected, right? So for white supremacists, they're concerned that the demographic changes in this country are going to result in the demise of the white race, that Jews are responsible for manipulating government and media, et cetera, and that manipulation is going to allow immigrants in this country, for example, and that the white race will be extinct. But what we're seeing, in addition to the sort of white supremacist explicit version that we have seen motivate the attack that we're talking about today and a series of other attacks, is that this theory is also resonating within more mainstream circles, right? Look no further than Tucker Carlson and Fox News. Look no further than some of the commentary out of the mouths of other pundits and elected officials. Now, they may not be as explicit, they may not be always specifically talking about the Jewish community, but talking about demographic changes or efforts by, say, another political party to bring in immigrants so that real Americans are going to lose their vote. I mean, it's just different language, but it's the same toxicity. It creates the same harm. And so what's really different in this moment in time than 10 years ago is that all this terrible stuff that we're talking about on these fringe online platforms are finding voice and getting normalized in our public discussion. Now, I don't know if the Buffalo shooter or other young white men who have engaged in these shootings are watching Fox News. I suspect they're getting their information on 8chan and YouTube, and not even I suspect we know. But in a society where some of the fundamental narratives that are encouraging people to target communities with violence are normalized in our public discussion, we need to try to identify ways to also push back against that, and not just the most fringe platforms, because they are connecting ideologically, and frankly, we ignore that too at our own peril.
Thank you, Warren. Rita.
Good morning. Thank you, Oren. Thank you, Emma. Perfect. You really set up the picture for me. I'm Rita Katz, the Executive Director and founder of Site Intelligence Group. I was here a year ago talking about exactly what we are seeing or saw in the last year. I mentioned how we are facing new kind of terrorism. And my new book that is coming out finally in October, Saints and Soldiers, an insight look into the new age of terrorism, really provides the explanation of a lot of what Oren just said and Emma about how these people are all different. I describe it last year here as a new kind of terrorism in the far right is something that was instigated when Robert Bauer carried out his attack. And that's where we saw something very different which I called screw your optics. Remember when he went to carry out his attack, he said, screw your optics, I'm going in. And that was a whole new change from the optics that was very much under control and pushed by the far-right community, by sites like Stormfront, into a whole new movement of we have to do something to change what's going on. Because if we're not going to do it, nobody's going to give it to us. political differences, political solutions are not going to be the answer. And so he created a movement that many others then followed. Brendan Tarrant, New Zealand attacker that Oren mentioned, was really the one, though, that took that whole idea of screw your optics to a whole new level, and then followed by many other shooters. And I want to focus on what really connected these shooters. We heard here ideology might have been one, but I say that ideology today actually take the back seat to online culture. And it's the online culture, the existence on message boards, platforms, applications, that really make this connection and radicalization very quick. So I would like to start with really going very briefly on what connected these shooters. The Buffalo shooter, there's no doubt, like we heard before, no doubt, he was part of another episode of chains of reaction that started this whole new movement of new kinds of terrorism that we have seen not only in the far right, but also ISIS. Sitting here today trying to find solutions for how we're going to fight this, it really, for me, a deja vu of the times where in 2007, 8, 9, and later on, sitting with very important people, decision makers, GIFTC form, trying to decide how are we going to stop these lone wolf attackers all over the world. And we're doing now the same. And the solution for ISIS was, let's remove the media. If we remove the media, you can stop the next attacker. And what happened is, with Robert Bauer, as Oren mentioned, carried out the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in October 2018 because he hated Jews. He was radicalized on a message board on the platform Gab, social media that replaced Twitter for the far-right communities that were these platforms from main social media communities. When you bring people together, radicalized people that were pushed already from the mainstream media to a house where there is no moderation, and there are many other radicalized people like them, it helps and it quickly radicalized many more to become even more radicalized than they were before. Bowers ended up carrying out his attack for ideological reason that he really hated the Jews, and he had a lot of other issues. Tarrant was inspired, I wouldn't say inspired, but was triggered by Bowers. The fact is that he said, when he posted his manifesto on 8chan, screw your optics. He took the exact same words from him, but Tarrant didn't have any problem with Jews. In fact, he says in his manifesto, I don't have a problem with Israel, I don't have a problem with Jews. He was worried more about the replacement theory, the white genocide, but his threat was the refugees in Europe, Muslim refugees all over the world. And he wanted to fight that. His manifesto, his video, streaming video, and the successful massacre that he had, successful in the sense of the white supremacists, was something that in many ways I described to the 9/11 shooting, or actually to Zarqawi's beheading of Nicholas Berg. The whole chapter is described how the communities behave differently. We at SITE never saw anything like after Tarrant's shooting online. Never. It was something that spiked the community to a whole new levels, that it was clear this is not going back. That what you're seeing now on the online communities of the far right is a totally different community. It's the screw your optic community that was pushing everyone for an urgency. You have to do something. And then 6 months later, was it 6 months later? Yes, May 2019. 3 months later, John Ernest in San Diego carried out his attack, and he said specifically in his manifesto that he was inspired by Bauer and Tarrant, and memes and the imagery that he saw on the forums. And I want to quote a sentence actually from first of all, Tarrant, who said, when he went to, in his manifesto, he said, MIMS, March 15, 2019, he said, MIMS have done more than eco-nationalist movement they ever done for me. MIMS, it's the culture, the internet culture. And what happened when he carried out his attack? He was saint. Bowers was saint. Ernest managed to kill not too many, not like Bowers and not like Tarrant, but he was immediately dubbed as saint of the community. And then followed him was El Paso shooter. El Paso shooter specifically denied the white supremacists. He refused to be called white supremacist. He got the idea to carry out the shooting because he read Tarrant's manifesto on 8chan. And he said, I knew I wanted to kill. I didn't know who I want to kill. In his words, he said, Tarrant was the one who gave me the idea for the attack. My motives for this attack are not all personal. Actually, the Hispanic community was never before my target. He read and saw the video of Tarrant, and that inspired him to attack. Ideology here didn't play a big role for him, but he wanted to kill. He was named by his neighbors and friends as a loner. He was named as somebody who wasn't really fitting in the society. And when we look after that, there were several other attacks that I mentioned in my book, and I even described last year. The Holly attack that Oren just mentioned, and Norwegian attacker, they all mentioned the attackers before them. And it doesn't matter that even in the Norway attack, he wasn't even able to kill anyone. He carried out the attack, but as he was going to carry out his attack, actually a Muslim old man in the mosque attacked him, and he was arrested. He failed to carry, but he was a saint. It didn't matter what your motive is, what is your background, and why you're carrying out your attack. And how can this not remind us of how much the ISIS attackers were so similar? They were coming from totally different backgrounds, totally different reasons. Some of them didn't even know who Baghdadi is. I remember the days when we were going through Twitter, and ISIS was putting so much media. It still does, not as much, of course, but social media were flooded with ISIS media. And what made the 3 Colorado girls that I studied for a long time, 3 Colorado girls from good families that none of what they had fit the profile of any future ISIS brides, decided to leave everything behind, teenagers, the ages of 14, 15, 16, and to join ISIS. They didn't read what ISIS stands for, but it was cool. It's a cool environment. And when we were looking at the Buffalo attacker, true, he had a whole diary in Discord. You know how many followers he had on Discord? I couldn't prove that he had any other followers in his Discord channel. It was his own diary. And in his own diary, he was describing himself as somebody who, as Emma said, he wasn't happy with himself. He called himself a loner, a loser. He mentioned himself as having the difficulties in speaking. He hated himself. And he's not the first shooter that we see individuals who are not socially welcome. They don't fit in today's society. They don't fit with friends. They don't have that. And how did he suddenly become white supremacist? He was an individual who was looking for a movement. He was looking for a community. He was browsing one day on 4chan, and he happened to see a GIF of a small man shooting And he liked that. So he decided, let me check this out. And he saw that this was Tarrant, and he was carrying out his massacre at the New Zealand mosques.
Rita,
My time
sorry.
is out.
Yeah.
All right.
Stop right there. Is that okay?
Okay, so
ahead.
based on what we saw, he had just stumbled upon the white supremacies. And he, like Oren said, adopted ideology that took him into this community, that adopted him. And because we understand today that what makes these shooters is more the online safe haven that they have, you can fight them in a way that doesn't really require bombs and arrest. And yes, we monitor, like many other communities, and try to prevent the next attack. But what we see is that there is always someone that is not being seen, that is able to carry out his attack. So we can't just go and try to find all these isolated individuals. But what we need to do, and as I suggest in my book, there are very clear solutions. You can fight it. It's very simple if you adopt the solution that was adopted in fighting ISIS.
Thank you, Rita.
And sorry for the extra time.
Thank you. In calling on Marc-Andre, I'm going to prompt Oren also that I hope you'll have a response to what Rita said when Marc-Andre is done. Go ahead, Marc-Andre.
So I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup and cover some of the elements that were left out.
I was hoping you would.
So one of the big things that I guess I'm going to cover is the technological dimension of this. And I think it's important to highlight that the perpetrator carefully researched and planned online every single dimension of his attack, looking at the affordances of different platforms and learning from what others have done in the past, whether successfully or their failures. And one of the things about this is he hopes that others will take those lessons learned and apply them themselves. One thing to highlight is the Buffalo shooter does present something unique in he did leave us 873 pages of writing. He left us 7 months of his train of thought. And this is something that is extra juicy, and we like that as practitioners and researchers, but it also can't be representative of every other single case because this is out of the norm. So we can't also use this as a single case study and make all these ultimate decisions. But it does give us a unique insight into this individual's mind and the process he went through. So some of the elements to highlight from this, first and foremost, is securitized communication. The individual used Discord, specifically a private Discord server, to actively plot, plan, and create a diary of his everyday life, whether it's his worries, his racialized beliefs, the entire process of what he was going through. And he was sharing content from past shooters, their manifestos, their videos, notwithstanding that this content was actually hashed within the GIFCT database and is part of elements that are automatically removed online. This presented with him a level of anonymity and pseudonymity online. Discord probably was a platform that he used based on one element of his behavior or his activities, which was he was an active gamer. He spent over 2,000 hours playing various video games, so he was familiar with some of the platforms that he used, particularly Twitch and Discord and Reddit. These are all platforms that are popular with young men within the gaming community. So there are elements that are unique to this individual, unique to the type of individual that he is. What we can learn from this attack is that he was able to have total privacy for 7 months to plan this attack. So when one of the popular questions, how are we not seeing these individuals? How are we not catching them? If we think of how Charlottesville was used, or how Charlottesville's planners used Discord, how that information got out was other people's in the chats leaked it. If a single individual in there had it for 7 months, there's really no way for it to be reported unless an automated system would pick it up. And within the context of a private server, they're actually encrypted within the Discord context. So he had total privacy. Now, there's positives to the encryption dimension, and there's other issues with it, but that's how he was in there at the space. The server became private when he invited 23 of his friends moments before the attack, which really gave them about 20 minutes to get an idea of what was going on. The other element, other than securitized communication, that's important to highlight is live streaming. We've beaten that horse to death, but I do think it's important to highlight again that he did use that platform. And when it came to live streaming attack, he did want to use Facebook, giving it an ode to the Christchurch shooter. But again, for him, as I mentioned yesterday, he believed that Facebook, is only used by boomers, and he limited himself to Twitch to stream his attack. The problem is, he didn't have a big Twitch following, he's not some massive influence on the platform, so you don't really get to the front page of the streams on the site. 22 people invited had the link, 3 of them reported it out of 19. I'm gonna give that pretty good stats considering the type of people he likely invited to his Discord server. As soon as it was reported, Twitch has learned from the past, and I think they did a decent job of taking it down quickly. Is it perfect? Obviously not. Don't expect perfection from this field, but as we're improving, I think it is good to see them get better at taking down this content, but it does rely on individuals to report the content and take it down, which does mean that as a community, as a society, we do have a responsibility in this space to report and take this content down. Another element that hasn't been discussed as much is online shopping. Most of the material that he got for this attack, he bought via eBay. He bought via swapping subreddits, like swapping subreddits for tack gear or equipment. All the stuff that he purchased, not illegal. All the level 3 armor are actually within the terms of service to buy within the US on eBay or on Amazon or on Facebook Marketplace or Instagram Marketplace. But he did use these platforms as a way of purchasing them. And it is part of the advice that he gave within his diaries on how others who want to emulate his attack to do so. He was also part of K-boards. Now this is within Chan culture, an image board dedicated to guns and weapons. This is where he spent most of his time getting to know the type of equipment and gear. This guy was a gear nut. Amar spoke about it yesterday when he was planning his attack. He planned everything down from his underwear, his socks, to his helmets, to his body armor. We knew everything about how he chose his equipment. There was an obsession there. And you see that as he writes online, that there is a commitment and a dedication and understanding to this, and he's trying to pass on that knowledge. That's his unique feature. It's not the Christchurch shooter's ideological creation that he's emulating. He's really giving people techniques, and procedures so that they could become better killers. Another important feature of the online dimension is permanence. There is a permanence of violent extremist content found online, which is immortalized as a canonical material belonging to the saints of the white race. And it continues to play a role in the ecology of radicalization. The advice of past attackers, and all likelihood, those who will come in the future, will continue to be found not only on alt-right tech sites and channels, on mainstream platforms as well, on archival sites, on these small platforms that don't have the resources to police, monitor, and catch everything that's there. And these will continue to act as a conservatory of hate. However, this archiving doesn't happen alone. The user himself planned to have his manifesto and diary archived across platform. When you look at the first post that he had for people who would see his Discord, it was links to multiple streaming platforms, multiple cloud storage platforms. Why? Adversarial shift. He's learning how platforms take down content. So he knows he had 3 Google Drives, he had 3 mega folders, he had 3 streamables, he had multiple backups to everything that he was doing to make sure that a copy and an element of his writing and his video survived. And that was an objective. They're learning as we improve at our own jobs. And that is something that we need to keep in mind. These adversarial shifts are important. And what's happening is actors on platforms that are not shooters, but on places like 4chan and Kiwi Farms, are curating and collating these elements the same way that practitioners do. And they're archiving and saving them. And as much work as we can do with the mainstream platforms, those that are part of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, the work that Tech Against Terrorism done, the work that we do individually, ultimately, these other platforms create these archives and they keep them. Even though Kiwi Farm is quote unquote down right now, you can still find the original thread from the Buffalo shooting that has the videos, the pictures, the manifesto, everything is still archived and online. This is a history that is left to this individual, and this is what they want. They want to be remembered, they want their names out there, they want to be promoted. And if there's one thing that we could learn from past incidents going all the way back to ISIS and beyond, don't promote them, don't mention their names, don't give them this type of power and immortalization that desire. This is part of the goal that they want. This is why they create all this propaganda and this material. It's inspirational, and it's also giving them this recognition within the community. Now, continuing to look about these adversarial shifts, the Buffalo incident does highlight vulnerabilities that are arising from the post-organizational nature of violent extremism and the abuse of online ecosystems that continue to happen on many small services or unmoderated platforms. So the ecosystems do engage in these highly adversarial behaviors and these tactics, and supporters and sympathizers continue to edit, modify, repurpose these contents in creative ways to defeat the detection and moderation of system for mainstream platforms. Now, it's hard to describe because I don't want to give away all the details, but there's some things that you can modify and edit videos where we could hash all the videos we want, but every time a new version comes out, you still got to rehash it. There's ways to change it, modifying the video. So as we learn and improve, so are they. It's always this cat and mouse game when we're trying to play in this space. And it's something I think we do take for granted as experts and practitioners that we know this happens. But I think for those who are not imbued in this space, it's important to understand that in reality, we're always one step behind when it comes to how they're shifting, and we're trying to catch up. And this is a challenge that we have in this space. And it's not reflective of all the good work that does happen, but it's also reflective of the fact that we do need to improve and try to have our own adversarial shifts on how we actually adapt to these tactics that they're using. The final thing that I think is important to highlight is communal harms. And the online content really has a real impact on these communities, dating back to any of the mass shootings we've had recently. Members can view and share the content for their own reasons, but it's also shared by teens, by children. It is also used, specifically videos from Christchurch and Buffalo. These videos are used and sent to the families of the victims as a way of re-traumatizing them, as a way of retargeting them. So even though the incident and the initial harm has happened, these are still used to re-traumatize and target individuals over time. And these are some of the challenges that we face within the technological spaces.
Thank you, Marc-Andre. So we only have a few minutes left. Let me try to focus in on a couple of things. So one theme here is, while every attack like this is unique, there's a lot of similarities here with past attacks, and there's a learning that's going on from event to event. I'd like each of you to be thinking about a question, which is, looking back at this, are there moments in time or aspects about the perpetrator that might have offered themselves as an opportunity to intervene? Mental health or physical health issues, online cues, etc. So be thinking about that while I give Oren a chance to respond to Rita. Maybe you don't feel like you need to respond to Rita, but she said it's the online culture that matters. Ideology takes a back seat. You agree with that?
So if I heard you, what were the opportunities to see this coming?
No, but before that,
Yeah.
Rita's point about online culture
Yeah.
is really what drives the most important driver.
I mean, I think what we have learned is that there's no one thing that we could point and say, if we stop that, then we're going to prevent the next attack. Online culture is clearly where people are normalizing this hate and violence, where there are people who are preying upon others to try to motivate them. But what's, what Emma said, what's happening in the real world, their personal lives, is just as relevant to how they even get to some of these online spaces in the first place. So I think we make a mistake by saying, there's a silver bullet, and if there weren't these awful toxic spaces online, we're going to solve it. Or, if everybody was able to flag a concerned, kid in school who's getting bullied, that somehow we would stop extremist violence. Or, if our elected officials or pundits were a little bit more responsible. None of that is going to stop it on its own. But together, these are all things that need to be worked on in order to identify the next threat.
All right, that's a good response. So how about my question about, were there particular cues, opportunities to intervene? Emma, have you thought about that?
Sure. I mean, definitely what I was mentioning earlier about this, in the history of physical violence and the incident with the cat, going to his mother after having cut an animal into pieces and asking for a box to bury the cat, and the parents not asking any questions and just providing this, and seeing further isolation. There is definitely an opportunity to intervene there. And I think it's a difficult conversation to have, but there are parental tips that you can give in order to identify also those early warning signs. I think the mental health community as well and the school staff of having a good follow-up. It's not, as Aaron was saying, it's not just like one person that could have changed it all, but there is different people that do have a role to play, that do have a responsibility. And I think the reason why talking about this human factor and this behavioral factor is important is because often we end up talking about online culture and data points, and we just like distance ourselves from the discomfort, also realizing that those are human beings that perpetrated those attacks, and that they have a whole support network that could have interfered at some point and that could have intervened.
Good, thank you. Other reactions to this?
Just super quickly, how about we just make it more difficult for the types of memes and violent images and language to circulate so easily online? And I mean, again, that's not going to solve it. We're not going to always prevent it, but we ought to strive to create more fiction so when somebody is looking for that, it's harder to find. It's harder to circulate, and it's harder to become part of a global network of extremist propaganda.
You can,
I would like to add to that also.
please, go ahead, Rita.
Just to talk, when we're talking about Buffalo attacker, for instance, and many of the other attackers, again, I repeat that ideology doesn't take the front seat, but it's the back seat. In his case specifically, it was very well illustrated. He wasn't a white supremacist until he saw Terrence's video. He was a video gamer. And neo-Nazi communities today, neo-Nazi terrorists, are not just neo-Nazi. They are much more than that. It's a much larger community. It's a community that welcomes incels. Incels attackers are called saints, and oftentimes they use the very similar ideology, and they are part of the community today. The community of gamers, video gamers, that are very much on the chance as video gamers and Discord, and happen to radicalize each other. And it's much more than that today with also Buffalo, the attacker also mentioned QAnon. He mentioned conspiracy theories. It grows. It doesn't only end with the white supremacist community, with neo-Nazism, but they adopt and they take into their safe haven all these alienated men, those that are unhappy with what's happening today. And so when they are welcoming them and they become part of the community like ISIS did or Al-Qaeda did, we welcome everyone who wants to join us. It really creates the problem of not specifically related to ideology. People were not white supremacists, but they became white supremacists after they joined the community. And really the only way to fight this, as we heard from Mark, the ICT sector, from sharing sites to websites to video streaming, it's a whole network of not one specific social media, but it's all together that makes this community very dangerous, because they can continue to bring people in and radicalize them. Look, we at SITE live on these places, from Telegram to Gap to all of them. And we move with them wherever they move. And I have to tell you that we have lost a lot of people because they couldn't carry the content on these forums. It is very harsh, very difficult to really read and just adjust it. And no wonder that people that already have issues will very quickly be more radicalized. It takes them no time. John Ernest, the San Diego attacker, was on a dean student. He had a great future ahead of him. But when he read the manifesto, Terrence's manifesto, the urgency of you have to do something, otherwise we're going to be gone, took him 6 months to carry out his attack. The ICT sector, there's no solution of fighting this whole new kind of terrorism. We all here mentioned the ICT involvement. Emma mentioned the Discord and other platforms. Oren didn't stop talking about how important the safe haven of these communities and Mark listed a whole list. But we can't just target one platform. It's not about taking down one specific site, whether it's Kiwi Farm or Gab, but you have to be able to carry out a very well coordinated campaign that have people that really understand that ICT sector is the one that can take down this. Like I call it, this is people are being born terrorism as terrorists online, and the only way to fight it is online. And in my book, I have a few chapters that really detail how you can do it.
Thank you,
as
Rita.
the successful case of ISIS.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you very much. So it's clear that we're learning a lot. We learned a lot from studying the Buffalo shooting, but it's also clear that the perpetrators are learning a lot from each other. I hope we've set the groundwork for the next session, which is going to solve all the problems that we've identified. Please join me in thanking our panel.